I'd like to welcome everybody to Frederick Charter School. My name is Ann Seckler. I am the Advocacy Chair here at FCCS, and again, thank you all so much for coming. So a couple of weeks ago was National School Choice Week, an event that is designed to celebrate choices in education. Those include charter schools, magnet schools, homeschooling, as well as private education. So take a scarf on your way out and share them with somebody and show your support for school choice in Maryland, okay? At this time, I want to introduce Lonnie Robb. She's a very hardworking member of the Board of Trustees here at FCCS.
I just wanted to, on behalf of the members that are here and also have other commitments, our board is very thankful for your presence. And also I want to point out some folks that have taken the time out of their very busy schedules, not only like us, they work day, but also come to events like this at night to make sure that all the bases are covered and that they have the opportunities to learn as much as possible. And from Congressman Delaney's office, Taylor Donahue is with us this evening. And also County Council at large, but she's also the president of our County Council, Buttocus. With that, I will,
Thank you. So school choice is a large and sometimes a pretty heated topic, but I think we all have the responsibility to learn what our lawmakers in Annapolis and in DC are up to, especially when it comes to education and charters, more especially. So it's with special excitement that I welcome Nelson Smith to our first Parent Education Evening of 2016. Mr. Smith is a consultant on education policy and public charter school. He's the former president and CEO to the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, working to grow the number of high-quality charter schools available to all families. He served as the executive director of the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board and as VP of Education and Workforce Development at the New York City Partnership. He's currently an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Mr. Smith was given a Career Achievement Award from New Schools Venture Fund to recognize his leadership in education reform. Please join me in welcoming Nelson Smith.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for all being here tonight and coming out on this chilly night. Really appreciate you being here tonight, and I really appreciate being asked to come and talk, especially because this school I've heard so much about. I actually live right down the pike in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, not far from here, and I've been kind of kicking myself that I hadn't gotten to see Frederick Classical Academy until tonight. So this is a real treat, a real pleasure for me. Let me just ask in the audience, how many here are parents of kids in the school? Great. Are there other board members as well who didn't speak? Congratulations on your accomplishments and getting the school started and underway and going strong. So that's great. One of the things I read up on in getting ready for this talk was the annual report. The last one was published, and it said that there was an unusual level of parent participation in the school, which is always a good thing, and it means that the school welcomes and embraces that and counts on your participation, and it means that you know that you can come and see how the kids are doing and see how the school is doing firsthand. So that's a really good sign. I think it probably will be useful to kind of start at the beginning a little bit and talk a bit about where the concept of charter schools came from. What I want to focus tonight on mostly is the question of the law that governs charter schools, how they look nationally and how it looks here in Maryland. And then let's have a conversation, and I really mean that. In the time we have allotted, I could go on and on and on and on. Anybody who knows me knows that if you say the words charter school, push the button and I will talk. It's been a movement that I've been part of for the last 25 years. So I want to kind of give the broad sketch, but feel free to ask about or make a comment about any question or any issue that you have on your minds, because charter schools, you might have heard, can be a little controversial, and not everybody marches in lockstep in agreement with the whole concept. So let me start by just saying a little bit of history. As I said, I've kind of been part of this movement in one way or another almost since its founding. Where did this thing come from? A charter school, first of all, is a new kind of public school. I stress the word public because that is written into the charter law of every state that has enacted charter schools. There are 43 currently. There were 44 until a couple of months ago when the Washington Supreme Court, on the other end of the continent, struck down that law. The state Senate is in the process of bringing it back. It will soon be 44 again. But every state stresses that charter schools are public schools, but they are not run directly by the existing public school system. They are independently operated. They operate on a performance contract, which is called a charter, which sets out certain measurable goals that the school has to meet over the course of whatever the charter term is. It's 4 years here. It's most commonly 5 years in the rest of the country. And the basic bargain is autonomy for accountability. And the idea is that in exchange for being freer to do certain things than traditional public schools are, to be free of a lot of the rules and regulations that public schools have to comport with, the other side of the coin is higher accountability. And that means that if you do not fulfill the goals for which you're chartered, you can actually be shut down. And lest you think that's an empty bargain, the fact is that this last year we shut down 272 charter schools around the country because they did not make their objectives. And that, by the way, is a larger number significantly than the year before. Believe it or not, we actually think that's a good thing. I say we because I'm currently actually working with NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, which published that handout that you see. We represent the authorizers around the country. And we really, our highest value in terms of chartering is to have high quality charter schools. And so the fact that some that don't make it go away, we see as a good thing because that is the bargain. And if you look at the actual data on performance of the charter sector over time, the performance is getting better and better in the aggregate because we're not letting the schools that don't make their goals stick around. So there really is autonomy on the one side and accountability on the other side. Now, why did this come about 25 years ago? The first charter law was written in Minnesota. It was written by a Democrat named Ember Reichgott Young. And the reason was originally that they wanted to provide a way for teachers especially to exercise greater professionalism and to grow in their profession while staying in the classroom. There was also a strain in there of wanting to create independent schools that weren't kind of under the heel of the traditional education bureaucracies. And these things kind of merged, and it became a very appealing notion because for folks on the right, they can say these are schools of choice. They empower parents. They let parents really be in the driver's seat in terms of their kids' education. For kids on the left, it was about liberation. More and more of our charter schools actually serve low-income kids, kids in the inner cities, and so this was a path to liberation for folks who embraced this notion on the left. And that's one of the reasons why, at least at the federal level, we've had a really strong bipartisan support for charter schools over the last 25 years. There came an important point, though, in the early 2000s when we already had started to see a fair number of charter schools going under. And they're going under because they weren't making their mark academically, or because someone had their hand in the till and there was some sort of financial fraud, or because the governance, the boards of the charter schools were not behaving correctly. And so at the National Alliance, I became president in 2004, and the first thing we did was to create a task force on charter school quality and accountability. And to say very loudly, it's not just about giving another choice to parents, making sure that there's another place they can put the kids during the day. We have to offer high quality charter charter schools. We have to stand for something better than a mediocre school system or a mediocre school down the street. And so from that basic manifesto that we really wrote in 2005 came a lot of other activities that we've been pursuing until this day. One of them being the creation of a model charter school law. And the reason we did that is that there had been, model charter laws put out before this, but their basic motivation was to say, how do we open the spigot further? How do we make sure that you can start a charter school without any problem? How do you make sure that they're fully funded? How do you make sure that there are no constraints on chartering? And that's all good. And we want to see robust growth. But we also said, what are the elements in the law that will actually help strengthen the schools and make for the kind of quality charter schools that parents will want to enroll their kids in, and that will be renewed after their 5-year contract is up, and that will really be a shining star in the education marketplace. So we brought together the smartest people in the country, and they sat down and they created this model law. And it incorporated all these quality-oriented elements. So yes, you have to have the kinds of application processes spelled out in the law that make sure that you'll have a rigorous process and you'll only take the applicants that are actually qualified to open a strong school. We had seen already that too many charters have been handed out for political reasons or because somebody knew somebody, and we wanted to make sure that there was a rigorous and objective and transparent application process. We looked at oversight, and that's what, by the way, when I say oversight, that's what the authorizer is charged with doing. The school has its own governing board, which is responsible for the actual oversight of the school, but that the charter is held by the governing board, and it's the authorizer that oversees that school on an ongoing basis and makes the decision whether it will be renewed. So we wanted to see strong oversight processes. We wanted to see clear, transparent renewal criteria. Now, what do I mean by that? When you get a contract for a charter school, when you get a charter, it says over the course of X amount of time, you're going to get to this place, and if you succeed, you will be renewed for another term. Yet around the country, many, many folks in charters can't answer the question, do you know what you have to do to be renewed? Because the processes are not clear. The law does not require them to be clear. And therefore you have decisions made by authorizers that are not transparent, where they've made them on the basis of some backroom consideration, and it's not an open process based on criteria that are the same for all schools. So we wanted to see that. We want to see financing in place. We want to make sure that charters are funded equitably. We want to make sure that there are facilities provisions made available for charter schools, which is, I know, a really interesting point here in Maryland. We want to make sure that the school's autonomy is protected. And I'll come back and talk about that in the Maryland context in a moment. But all these things were elements of the charter framework that we wanted to see embodied in law. And then the staff said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to have a state-by-state ranking against our model law. And I fought tooth and nail against that because I thought that was, it's a publicity stunt, it's that sort of thing. But I'm happy now that they dragged me kicking and screaming into doing it. Because every year when the charter rankings come out, that the National Alliance publishes, and they do this every year now, since 2007 or 8, people pay attention. And people in the states look at the model law and look at their rating and say, wow, we got a 0 on this component. Or how did we not score as well as we thought we would on that component? And then they go back to work. And that's why, over the last several years, in state after state, you've seen legislatures using components of the model law reform their state charter laws and draw them closer and closer and closer to what the model looks like. So I guess the unhappy news in this room is that you may know Maryland has not done very well in this rating. This year it was a whopping 43rd out of 43, right at the bottom of the barrel. And it's been kind of hovering down there for the last few years. So I want to take a few moments and just talk about why that is. And I think, this is maybe pertinent now because we just had a legislative session in which there was a battle to get some of these things improved. And as often happens, I think you kind of got half a loaf. And I'll talk a bit about what happened and what that means. There's always the opportunity to come back and fight another day. Among the 22 different criteria, and I won't go down through all of them, there are a few that I think are particularly important. One is the question of having multiple authorizers. Now, I've used this term several times. It's probably still kind of mysterious to most people. It always is. In this instance, for Frederick Classical, the authorizer of this school is the Frederick County School Board. Those school boards, local school boards, are actually 90% of the charter authorizers in the country. There are more than 1,000 entities around the country that can now authorize charter schools, but each state decides in its own state who can do that work. Maryland is one of the few states that only lets local school boards be authorizers. In other states, you have institutions of higher education, colleges and universities. You will have nonprofit organizations, large-sized nonprofit organizations in a few states. You'll have a city council or municipality. You'll often have a state board that's involved either directly or as an appeals body. And then you'll also have what we call ICBs, independent chartering boards. And these are special state commissions, or institutes they're called sometimes, that are set up by the state just to oversee charter schools in the state. In other words, they have no other job. They are not trying to do charter schools while also running a school district or doing charter schools while also running a university. Their sole job is to be an approver and an overseer of charter schools. And I'm particularly fond of this model, in part because I was the head of one of those. And mentioned that I was at the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board. I was their first executive director. That is an independent chartering board. We had the great advantage in that setting of having a single focus. All we were trying to do was to approve and set up and oversee and renew great charter schools. And I think that's one of the reasons why DC, our neighbor, actually has such a flourishing environment. They have more than 100 campuses of charter schools now around the city, just in one city. And one of the reasons why is that they have an independent chartering board that has developed a really, really strong professional practice around this whole notion of chartering. And it is a professional practice. It's a profession that didn't exist before 1992. So around the country, all these people who do this work, we're still feeling our way. We're not quite there yet in terms of the perfect model. But it is very new, and this is actually one of the brightest lights to this day down here in DC. So the question is, for Maryland, do you have multiple authorizers? No, you don't. You have just districts. Now let me just say, from what I've heard some good things about the relationship between this school and Frederick County. I'm not saying that relationship can't work. Among the many hundreds of districts that are in this business around the country, some of them are terrific, do a terrific job. It's not about the type of entity you are, whether you're a college or a district or a nonprofit. It's what you do. It's, do you have a rigorous application process? Do you have good oversight and a good accountability system so that you have a lot of data about your schools, and you share that data with the schools, and you give them a sort of a critical friend perspective on how they're doing. Even though, it's autonomous, it's up to the school to fix a problem, it's up to the school to chart its own course, but the authorizer should be supporting that. So a second area that we're critically concerned about is funding. And you may have seen a statistic around the last few years about the comparison between how charter schools are funded and how district schools are funded around the country. There's been a number of studies, and they always seem to show that charter schools are at a disadvantage. Charter schools simply get less dollars than traditional schools do. And there are a number of reasons for this. Some of them kind of plausible. Like, as I understand it here, you get a certain percentage in dollars, and then the district provides services for the rest of the 98% of the budget that you're supposed to get. You're supposed to be almost at parity in Maryland. That's fine, as long as the school can decide what services it wants, and you don't just have a district saying, you will take what we give you. Because we've seen all around the country, when districts kind of give charter schools what the district wants to give away, you may not get the best services, whether it's special ed, help, or ELL assistance or things like that. So that's one way of doing it. But around the country, the two biggest contributors to why charter schools are underfunded, one, very few states do anything for facilities. Very few states do anything remotely resembling the actual cost of obtaining, building, buying, renovating, leasing school facilities. And that's a huge difference between charter schools and school districts. The school districts around the country have access to the state capital fund. Charter schools do not. Now, there's different ways that we kind of try to tackle that. In some states, they will give charter schools access to public bonds, municipal bonds, or state bonds. In California, they even passed a statewide referendum, and it was an amazing thing to see, where the voters of the state actually said a portion of the state bond will be devoted to charter school facilities. That was a major victory for the movement in California. Other states will try to encourage sharing of facilities. You know, there are a lot of places around the country where the regular public schools have kind of emptied out. And if you look at many of the northern and midwestern cities, and population has moved out, jobs have moved south, all these things that are big demographic shifts, but that means that you have a lot of vacant space in public schools. But guess what? The cities still control those schools, and they do not want to let charter schools in, by and large. So one way of coping with the facilities issue is for those places to rent that space in charter schools, or even give them right of first refusal on buying these vacant buildings. But state after state, we've had this battle trying to get the law changed so that the charter school has a right of first refusal if you've got vacant space. There's also co-location, where you literally have the same building, charter school here, traditional school there. As you might imagine, that doesn't always work out for all the reasons that you can imagine, but that happens in a certain number of places. The sort of ultimate solution, again, is in DC, though. What they do there is to figure out how much the city spends on capital, on facilities, for the kids who are in the regular school system, DC public schools. And on a 5-year rolling basis, they figure out what that is per capita, and then they deposit that into the charter school operating budget. Which means that every student who goes to a charter school in DC generates about $3,000 a year. Every student generates about $3,000 a year, which creates a really good, healthy stream of funding, and it creates a level playing field. That's one of the reasons why you've had so many private lenders willing to go into DC to help them build beautiful buildings. But that is all on top of the regular operating budget. So the school doesn't have to take the money out of its regular budget to pay for the leasehold or to pay for renovations. So that's a major issue. The third thing and the final thing I want to talk about in terms of the Maryland law is in every one of these charter state law rankings that you'll see, you'll always see some attention given to the question of, does the law protect the school's autonomy? And why do we care about that? You can just say, well, it's part of the charter model. They're supposed to be independent, autonomous schools. Charter schools have their own governing boards. They're supposed to be independent, nonprofit corporations. In almost every state law, they are independently incorporated. They're not part of the corporation that is the school district. So we can just say, well, that's the model. But why do we care about that? We care about that because charter schools are supposed to do something specific. Charter schools are supposed to be driven by a particular mission, by a particular vision of what kids can accomplish. And we regard autonomy as kind of the critical linchpin for making sure that that happens, because that means if you have control over budget, personnel, and program, you can actually form a school that will succeed in its mission. If you can bring on the kind of people who share that mission and who are as intense about it as you are when you found the school. And if people don't work out, it should not take, as it does in some of our big city systems, a year or 2 years or 5 years to go through all the paperwork and all the dance of the lemons, as they call it, shifting people from one school to another, to get that person out of your school. You know, if that person is not performing, you ought to be able to say, we need somebody new who is up to the task. So that's personnel. Budget, you have to have control of how you spend the dollars of a school if you're going to have a coherent vision. And program, which is sometimes overlooked when we talk about autonomy. Sometimes it's all about, you know, oh, you get to fire teachers, huh? Well, it's about program too. It's about, do you control the work day? You know, can you set the hours that the school is going to follow? The calendar, how long the school year is going to be. The type of discipline policies that you're going to have at your school. All of these things are part of the culture of the school. It's part of the program. And that's integral to succeeding in the mission of the school. Now, the law in Maryland does not protect you on this score at all. You don't really have control over these things to the extent that you should. The most, I think, glaring issue is that folks are employed by the school district. I don't know, I think Virginia has charter school employees employed by the district. I don't know of another state where that's the case around the country. Even where the district is the authorizer, that school, typically, the charter school, is independent, employs its own staff, is governed by its own autonomous board. There are small variations in different states, but that's the rule. So Maryland is really, really an outlier in terms of the level of autonomy. Let me just say one other quick word about that. We have these discussions about whether if you grant charters so much autonomy, will they run rampant with it? So for example, what about teachers? If you give a principal the right to terminate a teacher, doesn't that make a charter school just like, the old New York City school system in the old days before there was a union, where the principal had to sign off on every transfer of every teacher? Well, one thing we're learning in charter world after a couple of decades of growth is that you can't operate with schools like that. We are learning. We have learned, and lots of charter schools are now implementing policies that do provide teacher voice, do provide teacher growth in professionalism, input into the way the school is operated. Some kind of due process even where there is controversy about a termination decision. And family-friendly practices, because guess what? Even though a lot of our charter schools started off hiring young teachers right out of college, partly for economic reasons, but they find out that those kids often want to get married and have families. And you want them to be able to do that and then come back to you and stick around. If they're great teachers, you want to keep them the next year. So I was on the board of a great school in D.C., E.L. Haynes, and we went through that process of growth where, as a board, we realized we had to look at compensation policies, benefit policies, and issues around teacher life and family friendliness that would enable us to keep the great teachers that we had. So every one of these things comes with an asterisk like that. There are very few black and whites in this world. There are very few absolutes. It's still a very young movement, and that's one of the things that makes it exciting for me. This is the 25th year. This is the 25th anniversary of the first law. Next year will be the 25th anniversary of the first school, City on a Hill in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's still going strong. So it's a questioning, growing, dynamic movement. There is no particular goal except to provide more and more and more opportunities for kids to have a great education. There will be years when we grow a lot of new schools, and there will be years when we close a lot of schools. And sometimes the net is not as great as we'd like to see, but that's okay because it's all about quality. So let me stop there. I hope I've kind of raised a few interesting points for you, and I would love to let's have a conversation. And thanks. Yes.
I have some questions about, so when you talk about the model law, I'm curious if you have a particular school or a particular state that you could say, this is what works, this is why it works, and this is how it works.
Yeah. Excuse me. One of the tricky things about doing a model law is that the law itself is kind of a leading indicator. You know, you have to put something in law this year, let's say on an application process. So it'll kick in the following year, and it'll be the next year when you start to get applications. And when those schools open the next year, it'll have to be 2 or 3 years before you actually see data on how they're doing. So it's kind of a moving target like that. And you can't really draw a direct line between this provision of the law and that outcome, because they're schools, and there are a lot of variables. What we've tried to do is to say that, you know, based on professional judgment of people who've been in the field, these are the factors that will lead to sound growth. And we're now getting to a point where we can start documenting some of that very directly. We have a project going on, for example, at NACSA called the Quality Practice Project. And what we're trying to do is to shift away from sort of this professional judgment model and actually to draw those bright lines between certain ways of authorizing and certain outcomes for kids. If you look at any of these model laws that do rankings, though, you will consistently see several states that are at or near the top in terms of comporting with the model law, doing the right kinds of policies. And we just did a look at this in terms of the NACSA model law. And 11, I think, of the top 13 of the states that have adopted significant provisions of our law, of our policy recommendation, rather, also got very positive evaluations in CREDO statewide studies. CREDO is the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes at Stanford, and it's kind of the flagship research outfit in terms of charter evaluations around the country. And they have done 2 big national studies, and then I think 28 state studies and local studies. They have not, unfortunately, done one in Maryland, which is too bad. But several of these states that have adopted these policy recommendations also happen to have pretty strong record of performance in terms of actual student achievement. So, you know, right now I think I take that as a good sign, but we're still trying to drill deeper into that question. But if you look on the website, this one, which is the National Alliance, is qualitycharters.org, www.qualitycharters.org, and go to under the facts button, it says state law rankings, and you'll see the ones that wind up at the top. Sure.
Part of what I think is really interesting idea with authorizers is the Centers for Higher Education actually being able to authorize charter school. Can you talk a little bit about how that works and where maybe a state that is working in?
Yeah. Well, that's a classic example of the practices being more important than the type of entity that does it. There are several states that have university-based authorizers. New York has a state university. New York has one of the 2 big statewide entities, the Board of Regents, the State Board of Education is the other big statewide authorizer. SUNY is among the top 5 authorizers in the country, not just in terms of the size of their portfolio. They have probably 150 schools now around the state, but they have a wonderfully well-developed professional practice. I actually did a renewal review for one of their schools last year, and the background they give you, and the preparation they give you, and the rubric is so finely detailed that you go into that really prepared to do a good read on that school and how well it's performing. So that's an example of a great authorizer. In Michigan, most of the authorizers in Michigan are universities. Some of them are terrific. Central Michigan University happens to be one of the premier ones. They have, over the years, they've actually spun their authorizing office into what is now the John M. Engler, former Governor Engler, Center for Charter Schools. And they've produced all sorts of technologies policies that help schools report their data more efficiently, and done things like that that have really put them at the head of the pack, very high-performing portfolio. So there's a number like that around the country. I could also, however, point you to some others, including some in Michigan, that don't know what they're doing as authorizers. Missouri, for years, had almost all of its charter schools authorized by institutions of higher education. That was in the law, and unfortunately, most of those authorizing universities became authorizers because somebody went to the president of the university or dean and said, hey, I'd like to start a school, can you get me a charter? And they said, okay. That's how they became an authorizer. And they had no funding either to do that. So they developed very few of what we consider good professional practices. And there's been a number of horror stories in that state. So it really comes down to, for me, do you want to be in this business, first of all? You know, one of the things that we're working on in state after state now is called authorizer accountability. You know, chartering isn't just about having accountability for the schools. The people who do the authorizing work, we need to know whether they're serious about that very important business that they do. And to me, that starts with, do you want to be in the business? So Minnesota and Washington, in its law that is now in the process of being resurrected, we hope, had a process where nobody, districts or anybody else, can just be an authorizer because they happen to be named in the law. You have to come to the state board, present your credentials, your plan, your vision, and also talk about your capacity. You know, what are you going to put to do this right? And from there, you know, you can then determine whether they should be renewed as an authorizer over years. But I think the great thing about universities is that ideally they give you some terrific human capital, so that if you're going to be doing reviews of schools, there will be somebody down the hall who is a special ed expert, for example, or who knows, you know, modern foreign languages or whatever the topic is that you're looking at. For this school, it might be, you know, a Latin scholar. You have that type of resource in the university, and they can also handle the back office work for you if that's part of the deal. But there's too many universities that just have like a single shop, a single person who's actually isolated from all of that, because they don't really see how it comports with their real mission. And that's a case where I want to know, do you want to be in business or not? Yep.
Back to the issue of authorizers,
Yep.
and the reason I say issue, when crossing that bridge and trying to suggest the opportunity to consider somebody else to vet charter schools in either your region or your county or however it's orchestrated, one of the objections that has come forward is, you know, as a school system, your school and two other schools in our county are one of three, or, you know, 3 out of, you know, whatever the total number is. It has been suggested that the effort to have other authorizers or other members vet the charter school process, that we're trying to cause an additional layer of situation that they have to navigate. And I, you know, it's one of those things where you're like, well, yes, but no. So on the flip side, how do you overcome that objection, or how can you categorize the practice of this use in other regions, or how it's handled well within understanding the intricacies of a school system that, you know, there's constantly compelling interest with dollars and so on, and decision making and state law and county law and everything to consider.
Yeah. Very interesting question. I mean, I would start by saying there are many, many states that have faced that and worked it out, first of all. I mean, it's not unknown in history. And they work it out in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes there are sort of tacit agreements between a non-district authorizer and a district where that authorizer approves a school that's inside the district. And they just simply have an MOU or some sort of working understanding of what you have to do and what we have to do. Most of the time, the principal relationship, though, is between between the school and its authorizer. If you're in New York City, for example, the reality is that the authorizer, which might be State University of New York up there in Albany, doesn't control the buildings that your school is trying to get located in. The district, the city controls those buildings. So they have to work out a policy framework where the school is either entitled to some kind of space or has some sort of other accommodation. And the city council actually worked on that a couple of years ago. There are other states, I think in California, where that's almost all district-based authorizing. And there are actually 332 authorizers in California. You know, they have an enormous charter sector, and every little district, it looks like, has one school or two schools, all the way up to Los Angeles Unified that has, I think, 275 or 280 now. So there's this huge range, but it's all the districts that are in charge. And what happens there, they have resisted the argument that we and others have made that there ought to be other options, is that you have a lot of little districts that don't ever build any capacity and don't have rules of the road, and that lead to a lot of arbitrary decisions. And wouldn't those schools be better off if you had sort of a large regional authorizer, whether it's run by a part of the state agency or a university system or something like that? It would be a much clearer situation, in fact, if those schools weren't kind of subject to sort of vacillating different rules and arbitrary political decisions. But in those states that have both districts and a statewide or other kind of authorizer operating, most of the time they just have to work out an accommodation, whether it's in state law or as an agreement between them. The Georgia Charter School Commission, for example, has schools all around the state. There are also Atlanta and Decatur and other cities that are districts that are charter authorizers. So when the district is in charge, they will have a different set of rules because that school will be part of their district. When the commission is in charge, they have academic oversight and accountability, but not facilities and things like that. But they have to work those things out between the two entities. But it's not impossible. I mean, there's plenty of good models that I could point to around the country where this kind of issue has been surmounted. I think the other, you mentioned money. And that's an issue whether the authorizer is inside or outside. If you have properly understood autonomy in the state law, the money should be going to the charter school's budget, whether it's authorized by a district or by a state commission. In some states, they work it out so that there's more state funding going into the schools that are authorized by state bodies. The South Carolina Public Charter School District, for example, aggregates a number of state funds so that they don't put too much of a burden on local communities where a charter school is created. But each state works that kind of relationship out in its law. And I mentioned one other quick thing, not about money, but about who's in the driver's seat question. There are several states, and Colorado is probably most prominent among them, where under state law, the State Board of Education can basically declare that a district has earned its spurs in terms of being a good charter school authorizer, and they will grant them exclusive jurisdiction. So that if you're in Denver, for example, you have to go to the Denver School Board to get the charter. They have exclusive jurisdiction in the city of Denver. Although there is also a state charter schools institute that can put schools pretty much everywhere else in the state, except for those other few communities that have exclusive jurisdiction. So that's another way of kind of skinning the cat, so that if you have a district in the state that's really doing a great job, and there's no reason anybody has to go around it to get an approval and to get good oversight, you might consider giving them exclusive jurisdiction and letting a state body or a university handle the rest of the state. But that's what I mean by, somebody once observed that there really isn't a charter school movement. There are 43 of them. Charter laws are state by state by state distinctive, and they work these issues out in terms of what will work in that state.
Something that had come up last year when Governor Hogan had talked about changing the charter school laws here in Maryland was staff members being, not necessarily being employees of the teachers, of the county, in our case Frederick County Public Schools, and thereby members of the teachers union. So there was a lot of talk about the charter school itself employing, the nonprofit employing teachers. And you mentioned earlier when you were talking that pretty much around the country, the teachers, the staff members that work in these charter schools are employees of that nonprofit, of the charter school, not so much of the county that the school is in.
Right.
And I guess I just want to know, how do teachers feel about that? What are the positives and negatives? Do you have a lot of teachers interested in working in charter schools? When there's an opening for like a fourth grade math teacher, are you inundated with interest? What do teachers feel? Is it better or worse to be an employee of the charter school? From a teacher's perspective.
Yes. This is a whole evening discussion. Let me just try and kind of walk through that at a few different points, though. First of all, we need to make a distinction between the employer, being the district, and the teacher being a member of a union. Most of the time, those go hand in glove. If you work for the district, you join the union. That's the way it works in most places, except states that don't have collective bargaining. But those are two separate things. There are charter schools that are unionized. About 15% of charter schools around the country their teachers are members of teacher unions. Some of those are in places where the state law requires it, as here, or maybe not unionization exactly, but being part of the district. In California, if you are a conversion charter, if you've done a public school and you convert to charter status, the teachers stay in the bargaining unit of the district. So there are about 15% of charter schools that are unionized. And it is always the case that teachers in any public school in the United States have the right to organize if they want to do that. If they want to bargain collectively, that's their right under federal law. And believe me, I can tell you stories of charter schools that have gotten into trouble for not understanding that and trying to get in the way when a collective bargaining action started. There's a whole set of rules that you have to follow once it's jump ball, right? So teachers can organize at any time, and there is a certain, fairly small, but a certain number of charter schools where that's happened. And to your question of do teachers want to work in charter schools or not, those are places where the teachers